Welcome, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, webinar producer with CGLR. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping details. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources, slides, and bios shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. We will also be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. I'd also like to note that closed captions are available for both attendees and panelists. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen if you wish to turn those on. And lastly, I wanted to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week, we have an exciting doubleheader. The first, a funder-to-funder conversation at 12:30 p.m. with a focus on improved child health and well-being in Flint, Michigan. That same day at 3 p.m., we'll have a conversation on Beyond the Headlines, What Data Tell Us a Year Later. Then we'll invite you to open up the month of October with an exciting session on taking action, accelerating equitable learning recovery, and a Crucible of Practice salon the following week with CGLR communities with learning-rich spaces in everyday places. Registration information will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope that you can join us. And joining you now is Becky Miles-Polka, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you so much, Sierra, and thank you for everyone who is here today. We really appreciate you joining us for this really important webinar. We have all been sobered by the documented learning loss caused by the pandemic and the data that show that U.S. students continue to significantly lag behind pre-pandemic academic levels. Despite some progress in the past 2 school years, academic recovery remains largely stalled, with most students months behind those pre-pandemic levels in both math and reading, and those levels were far below what we would hope for children. Recent reports have documented this stalled progress, but we are seeing some opportunities to intervene and some districts and communities that are making progress. Today, we have the good fortune to have a conversation with some of the authors of these recent reports, exploring new data from 22-23 school year and bright spots that can inform our collective action to help children recover from the learning losses that they experienced during the pandemic. The Campaign for Grade Level Reading recognizes the magnitude and the long-term implications of learning loss caused by the pandemic, and we are placing a high priority on efforts to mobilize our network of over 350 communities and the broader field to accelerate equitable learning recovery. This session represents the first in a series over the following months where we will continue to dig into the data, bring ideas, bring proven models, and hopefully inspiration to mobilize your own partners, your own communities to tackle this challenge. Please plan to join us for these upcoming sessions on this critical topic. And now it's my pleasure to briefly introduce our panel, and I'll be posting a link to their full bios in the chat shortly. So Sierra, next slide, please. First, we have Avery Cambridge, who is an engagement manager with McKinsey Company. Peggy Carr, who is the Commissioner for the National Center for Education Statistics at the Institute of Education Sciences with the U.S. Department of Education. Karen Lewis is the Director of Policy Partnerships and Research, and she is with NWEA, which is now a division of HMH. And finally, Jennifer Sadam is the Senior Director for Research Strategy at Curriculum Associates. Next slide. And last but not least, you all know well, I think, our moderator, Hetty Chang, who is the Executive Director and President of Attendance Works, and we like to consider her our data guru moderator. So Hetty, welcome, and welcome to all our presenters, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Becky. It is a pleasure to be here with you, with everyone in the audience, and with what an amazing panel of researchers who help to make sure that research doesn't sit on the shelf, but informs what we do in practice and in the real world. I want to start with a first question. I'm going to ask Karen Lewis to start us off. And the question, which we're going to direct to everyone, is what do we know about learning loss during the pandemic? You know, I don't think we can fully solve challenges unless we fully understand what we're dealing with in the first place. So, Karen, what have you all at NWEA been able to understand about the impact of the pandemic on academic achievement and learning?
Thank you, Hetty, and thank you, Becky, for kicking us off. I guess I have either the privilege or the misfortune of starting this conversation to frame a little bit about what we know about the impacts of the pandemic and progress towards recovery thus far. I want to share a high-level summary of what my team at NWEA has found over the last 3 years and our ongoing research agenda investigating the impacts of COVID on student achievement. And these findings will rely on the MAP growth assessment data. If you're not familiar, MAP growth is an interim assessment. It's used in about a quarter of public schools across the country. But although this will be my assessment focused, I want to just preface this conversation by saying what we found is largely consistent with what we've seen from peer assessment organizations and other researchers doing similar work. But at NWEA, we've been able to take advantage of our deep well of longitudinal data on student achievement and growth so that we can track students during the pandemic and compare progress and achievement back to historical trends. This method has allowed us to not only understand differences in achievement, how much distance there is between test scores for students during the pandemic relative to the performance of pre-pandemic same grade peers, but we're also able to track growth trends and ask, are students making gains that keep pace with pre-pandemic trends? Understanding and tracking both achievement and growth is really critical. Achievement gaps, or the distance between how students are performing now relative to pre-pandemic trends, is how we quantify and understand how much unfinished learning remains. But it's also important to track growth patterns to help us understand how quickly we can expect to close those gaps. We know it's going to take accelerated or above average growth in order to help students catch up, and that's what we're really keeping an eye out for in our data. I want to put our most recent findings that we released in a report in July into context. So I want to summarize what we found over the last 3 years in a series of reports. Starting in that first full school year after the onset of the pandemic, we saw that as early as fall of 2020, the toll of that early phase of the pandemic and the school shutdowns that followed were already evident, and students started the 2020-21 school year with achievement levels that were below pre-pandemic trends, especially in math. And you see this on the figure there by the distance between those two symbols that represent average achievement in fall. Over the course of 2020-21, students were making gains. Notice those lines are trending upward, but those gains lag behind pre-pandemic trends. And as a result, the gaps that were already there in fall increased by spring. We think of spring of 2021 as the kind of bottoming out period. And this is the point when the harm from the pandemic was really at its peak. And that is the testing season in which we see the widest gap between mid-pandemic test scores relative to historical baselines. In 2021-22, that second full year after the onset of the pandemic, this was a year we saw a little bit of good news. There were still sizable achievement gaps, but a bright spot was that growth started to look closer to normal. And we were seeing students that were making gains at consistent rates, in some cases even slightly exceeding pre-pandemic trends. And as a result, the gaps between test scores relative to pre-pandemic trends was starting to shrink, albeit modestly. Another bright spot came in the summer of 2022, where we saw that the typical pattern is that students tend to lose a little bit of their test score over the summer months when they're out of school due to summer vacation. And that was certainly true in summer 22. But the trends we saw that summer was that that summer slide was a little bit muted relative to pre-pandemic trends. And as a result, those achievement gaps started to shrink even further. Our most recent report focused on the totality of the 2022-23 school year. And of course, we had hoped to be able to show additional progress to recovery and to show that those gaps were continuing to shrink. But unfortunately, we saw the opposite. And during 2022-23, what we actually found was that growth lagged behind pre-pandemic trends again. Remember, it's going to take above average growth to close those gaps. And in contrast, these patterns of below average growth actually widens the gaps. So in 2022-23, students actually ended the year a little worse off than where they started. So in other words, the big key story of what we saw in 22-23 was that progress towards recovery really seems to have stalled. I think there's a lot of factors that contribute to this, and I know my colleagues on this panel will help talk to that factors, especially things around chronic absenteeism. But I think it's also important to consider that the harm from the pandemic is really acting like a compounding debt. And by failing to address unfinished learning that has accumulated in previous years, students are less well prepared as they move into the next grade. And this may be actually impeding their ability to keep pace with pre-pandemic learning trends.
And Karen,
oh, sure, go ahead, Hetty.
Yeah, and we'll certainly have a chance to come back into that as we go on. So you're going to go a little bit more into what it takes to get kids caught up. So keep going.
Sure. So I think it's important to contextualize the size of the learning loss, because often when you hear about research that's showing how far kids off in terms of standard deviations, it can be difficult to really think about what that means in practice. And so I want to end by sharing some results that help us contextualize the remaining unfinished learning that we see at the end of this year. And what we've done in our work is translate the achievement gaps that we see into the months of learning required to help students catch up to pre-COVID levels. And this is a simple translation that takes and considers the distance between test scores now and how much it would take to get kids caught up, and then scales that according to the typical amount of gains we could expect kids to make within a year. And I'm showing that here in these figures. What we're doing is breaking out by grade and by subject the months of learning required to catch students up to pre-COVID levels. These estimates range from 2 to 7 months in reading across grades, and from about 1.5 to about 9 months in math. Averaging across grades, the typical student's going to need about 4.1 additional months of instruction in reading and about 4.5 in math. You probably noticed that wave to the right, and we see that it's going to take more instruction to catch up those older kids. It's not necessarily because they continue to have larger gaps. It's more because those students tend to grow at slower paces. So older and younger students tend to have similar distance to go. It's just going to take longer to get there for older students because they tend to grow at a slower pace. In summary, what we're seeing overall in our research in this most recent report and across a series of 9 reports is that students are showing some signs of pandemic recovery, and I don't want to lose sight of that altogether, but that progress has certainly been modest and has largely stalled during this most recent school year. Importantly, the amount of additional learning needed to catch up cannot be recouped in a single year or in one single magic silver bullet intervention, and that's especially true for older students. And finally, and most importantly, I think we can never lose sight of the fact that the achievement disparities that existed prior to the onset of the pandemic have only widened significantly over the last 3 years. And marginalized students are those that remain the furthest from recovery. We see no evidence in our data of special levels of catch-up among the students that have been hardest hit and have presumably been more targeted for recovery interventions. They remain further behind their peers in many ways.
Thank you, Karen, for just doing such an amazing job of framing this conversation, starting with what we know, and we'll continue to explore all these issues of what does it take to recover. But I want to first start by turning to some of our other panelists to see what else they can help us understand about what are the challenges in terms of what we've seen from the pandemic. So if we can go to slide 21, please, and have Jennifer be able to tell us what are you seeing from the data that Curriculum Associates has been able to collect.
Thanks, Hetty. I was not planning to share my slides. I thought that.
Okay, just tell us verbally then, please. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Hetty. Here at Curriculum Associates, we have used the term unfinished learning. So forgive me if I go and automatically go back to using that terminology over learning loss. It's just a habit of the work we do and the research we've been doing. I have the privilege of joining you to share the work of the research team here at Curriculum Associates. We too have been tracking how students are doing over the course of the last couple of years, especially since the pandemic. And in August, Curriculum Associates released 2 reports. The first report, which is going to be what I'm talking about here right now, and I'll talk a little bit about the second report in a bit, but the first report is our annual State of Student Learning report. And in that report, we share the results of how students are doing on the iReady diagnostic. Like the iReady diagnostic is administered to about 11 million students across the country and get grades K through 8 in both math and reading. And as I get into our results, I want to talk a little bit about 2 things that make this research a little different. First, we're looking here at a nationally representative sample of students. And we're looking at a nationally representative sample of students first in a historical cohort that is from the 2018-2019 school year. We also look at a sample of students in the 2021-22 school year and the 2022-2023 school year. That's a lot of 22s. And so we looked at results of 3rd graders in spring of 2023 compared to a nationally representative sample of 3rd graders in spring of 2019. This gives us a sense of how our current 3rd graders are doing compared to students who were in 3rd grade prior to the pandemic. So this is not tracking a cohort of students over time. It is simply just comparing achievement levels that we are seeing now in spring 2023 compared to what we were seeing prior to the pandemic. Second, our results refer to students who are on or below grade level. The iReady diagnostic is a criterion reference test that allows us to measure results according to grade level expectations. And so that is what you are seeing here. Our results show some slight differences from others, but are generally, the trends overall are consistent. We see some bright spots in our data, but at the same time, we also see that recovery is slow and in some cases stalled. And like NWEA and others, our data also show that academic disparities and inequities that were exacerbated during the pandemic show no signs of closing in 2023. Some of that data I don't have time to talk about today, but you can find our report on our website and dig into more detail. I wanted to take the few minutes I have here today to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the early grades. We administer the diagnostic to grades K through 8. So our State of Student Learning report includes results for students in grades 1 and 2. You will see when you're looking at the graph that in reading, students in grades 1 and 2, we have fewer students who are on grade level in 2023 compared to students who are in grades 1 and 2 prior to the pandemic in 2019. The gaps between now and the pandemic are largest in the early grades, as you will see as you get to grades 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, that the drop wasn't quite as significant past after the pandemic, and but the rates have stayed fairly stable. But you also notice that in those grade levels, the percentage of students who are reading on grade level is around 50%. And so we still have a long ways to go, even prior to the pandemic and even since then. If we also going back to grades 1 and 2, if you look at 2022 compared to 2023, you do see a slight uptick, and early grade reading is the one area where we do see a slight improvement in students who are getting to grade level. If we move to the next slide, I also have the results in math, and you'll see the same thing. Overall, the drops from pre-pandemic are more significant in math, and the improvement is really stalled there. There's not much change from 2022 to 2023, and including in grades 1 and 2. So that's the results that I have on math and reading. I think what we also see when we're looking at our early grade levels, want to remind you that the students who are in grade 1 and 2 were pre-K prior to this year, prior to the pandemic in March of 2020. And those students, despite not being in K-12 schools, still experience quite significant disruptions in the pandemic, and we're seeing that as they enter school, that they are coming in less prepared than their peers prior to the pandemic.
A sobering picture, Jennifer, for our youngest learners. Peggy Carr, would love to invite you to also share what are you seeing from the national data.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with your panel today. If we could bring my slide up, I'll talk a little bit about the National Assessment of Educational Progress, known as the nation's report card. It is the only ongoing assessment of what students know and can do in key subjects being reading and math since the 90s. All states are required to participate under ESSA. We have 26, 27 districts that also participated and a few jurisdictions. So this is a comprehensive picture of what students have been doing and exhibiting in the area of math and reading since we started the state assessments. Just in general, both mathematics and reading from the pre-pandemic period of 2019 to 2022, we see historic declines in both reading and math, particularly math. It was interesting to see the previous data from Curriculum Associates, because math is where the strongest declines have been seen. I should point out in both case of reading and math, we were actually seeing declines prior to the pandemic. The declines we noted in the national assessment started in 2013. I should also point out that both for reading and mathematics, the lower performing students at the 10th and 25th percentile have been showing the strongest decline prior to the pandemic, and of course exacerbated by the pandemic. I want to spend a little bit more time on reading, of course, unpacking what we see when we look at the entire distribution from the 10th through the 90th percentile. Starting with grade 4, what you see here is the fairly stable pattern across our reading results. That has generally been the case, but a 3-point decline is a significant decline for NAEP. And for the percentiles from the 10th through the 90th percentile, not shown here is a steeper decline for students at the 10th to 25th percentile, 6 points, 5 points, not shown here. But on the NAEP scale, that's pretty significant. To give you an idea of what that means for those students at the 10th percentile, they're now scoring lower than they did in 1992 when we first collected this data. Even for the average score, it is comparable to the 1992, as you can see here. So students who were struggling before are now in a place where they are really significantly disadvantaged, as indicated by these data. For 8th grade, the pattern is similar in as much as we're seeing declines across the ability distribution, from the 90th to the 10th percentile, but no particular area on the distribution is showing a stronger decline. I do want to say, though, there are some areas of bright spots, if we can call them that, for 8th grade reading that are worth noting. For the case of math, all states, all of them show declines in the jurisdictions, various jurisdictions as well. But for reading, we had 10 states that held steady. I'll put that in air quotes, meaning that they did not statistically decline. And that's good news, I think, in light of what was happening in this country during the height of the pandemic, that states could hold their own. Also, we saw that large cities, these are cities with 250,000 or more, that would describe and characterize them, they held steady. That is also a bit of encouraging news. 21 large districts also held steady for 8th grade reading. And there was at least one district, LA, Los Angeles, that showed a 9-point increase. There's lots of discussion around that, but the number is verifiably reliable from the NAEP data. And most student groups, racial ethnic student groups, held steady in 8th grade grading.
Thank you.
That's the big picture.
Thank you so much for that big picture and for calling attention to how can we look at places that had comparatively better results, because that can start to shed light on, what do we need to do to invest in ensuring more of our kids get those better results. And with that, I'm going to ask Avery to share, because she'll actually start looking at these results by state, the information we have about achievement by states, and that again helps us to gain some new kinds of insights.
Absolutely. And if you can jump forward yes, great. So we also used the data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And what we wanted to do is say, we have the national picture, what is the variation by states? So we compared the results of students in each state from 2019 to how they were performing in 2022, and found that on average, over 17 million students in the US have over half a year of learning delay. So that's 4.5 months of learning out of a 9-month school year. And to put this in kind of context, right, that's 1 in 4 students in the US. So that's a huge number. But as you'll see highlighted on the map, there's a huge variation in, which states students were further behind their peers pre-pandemic than others. So, relative to others, causes for celebration are states like Texas, Louisiana, even California, where you'll see, only 10%, 6%, 12% of students are over a half year behind relative to where they were pre-pandemic. But then other states like Oregon, Minnesota, Maine, you'll see, upwards of 80% of students are over a half year behind in reading and math than they were pre-pandemic. And there's a bunch of reasons for this, right? So we know that, decisions about when students went back to in-person learning have an effect, but there's also plenty of kind of interventions in the way that school districts kind of spent their COVID recovery ESSER funds that have kind of influenced which states have fared relatively better than others. So I'll start talking about those interventions in a bit. Really quickly, Heidi, if you just go to the next slide. I also think one important thing to note, right, is that even within states, there's huge levels of inequity, right? And that varies drastically. So I think, Peggy started talking about differences between the percentiles of students, but what this slide is showing, right, is the difference in learning delay between the top performing students in each state and the bottom 25% performing students in each state. And what you'll see here is states like Wisconsin, Washington, Pennsylvania, Florida, there's relatively little difference in how much kind of the bottom students dropped back. So the state kind of students moved together as, relatively one cohort. where in states like Virginia, Oklahoma, Maryland, Michigan, there's huge variation in kind of how big the gap kind of started to diverge between the top performing students and the bottom performing students. And I think this has, really, really broad implications for how folks kind of target their, at one point, COVID recovery funding, right? If you know that the bottom performing students are way behind the top performing students, you need to have more targeted kind of interventions and kind of selection of which districts, programs, students you're working with.
So Avery, let's use this a lead-in to the next question. If you go to the next slide, please, which is, what do we know about what works to promote learning recovery? What do you said you think there are some interventions that seem to help to explain some of the difference in states. Please tell us about what they are, and let's go to the next slide too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, research and education is always evolving, and we always need to be, trying, testing, evaluating new things. But one thing, when we kind of looked at our map and tried to start to parse out why states look differently, that was a little bit heartening, is we saw some themes of some common interventions that actually have proven to mitigate kind of learning delay and learning loss that we'll share with you now. With a caveat for many of the folks on the webinar that, knowing the evidence of what works is only half the battle, and I'll share those examples. The other half is implementation, and we know that can have a huge impact on how effective each of these three things are. So just noting that before I go through them one by one. So the first thing I want to talk about is, use of high quality instructional materials paired with high quality professional learning, right? So that's essentially making sure that kids are using curricula that's aligned to standards, that meets certain benchmarks for student engagement, and that also, meets certain benchmarks of helping teachers deliver that content effectively, and then also making sure teachers have the training to use it well in the classroom. So Nebraska and Louisiana are two great examples of this. During the pandemic, we saw Nebraska invest a portion of the state's ESSER recovery funds in kind of widespread availability of the digital math curricula, Zern, for students. And we saw that students that used the Zern math online regularly had, over 2.5 times the rate of learning growth in math scores on state tests than those that didn't use it regularly. So that's an exciting example. Another one is Louisiana. Louisiana has been kind of a leader nationally in promoting use of high quality curricula across the districts. During the pandemic, they allotted an additional $40 million to investing in additional supports for high quality curricula. So literacy screeners, additional science and reading curricula for kids. And Louisiana nationally saw a 2-point increase in the National Assessment of Educational Progress reading scores from 2019 and 2022. So a 2% increase. Nationally, the average was a 4% decrease, right? So they're really beating the trend there, and that's important to call out.
Avery, when you mentioned the state of Louisiana, I think it's an interesting state because during the pandemic, they also didn't see quite such great losses. They were able to recover some of their attendance by shifting to a more positive, less punitive, more wraparound approach. And you just wonder whether the combination of better curriculum with supports, starts to make a difference.
Exactly. And that's something I think that Karen also, a point in her summary slide, right, is there's no one silver bullet, but we know that combinations of things that are effective work, right? So the attendance interventions stacked with the curricular interventions, we see that it has an impact. A few other points to call out: high quality, high intensity tutoring. The example I'll talk about here is Tennessee. So Tennessee Department of Education invested roughly $200 million of the state's federal COVID recovery funds in availability of high dosage tutoring for their districts. We know one of the biggest challenges for high dosage tutoring is getting the human capital, right? The teachers, the tutors to deliver the program to students. The state published resources and kind of partner guides for districts to work with local college educator preparation programs, right? So local, college students that are studying to become teachers to build them into their tutoring program. And that has allowed the state to reach 8% of their students with high dosage tutoring over the pandemic. So really exciting example there, and kind of the learning gains of the students participating, those are quite large. The last one that I'll talk about is summer academies. And I think this is really relevant because when we looked at kind of surveys of how school districts were spending their ESSER funds, over 90% said they were going to offer some sort of extended school year, right? So that's an extra week of learning, whether it's in spring break, whether it's over the summer. Data still emerging from districts that did this during the pandemic. But one exciting example is from pre-pandemic, where we know Lawrence, Massachusetts, historically had kind of a school turnaround for the district. As part of the district's turnaround program, they launched these summer academies where they paired this district's top performing teachers with students in a 10-to-1 ratio over the summer academies. They reached over 5,000 students, and we did see that the math scores of participants in those academies increased by over 15 percentage points over the course of the first 3 years of participation. So that's a bright spot example, and I'll be excited to learn about additional examples that emerge from the pandemic.
Fabulous. Thank you, Avery. And I want to turn to Jennifer, because Jennifer, you've done a lot looking at how instruction makes a difference, connected to stretch goals, to professional development. How did that connect with what you've just heard Avery speak about, or maybe give us more sense of what some of the instructional approaches that help to make a difference?
Yeah, thanks, Hetty. We did some additional research on students who were meeting growth goals. And I think as we heard earlier from Karen about the data at NWEA and looking at growth over time and indicating the need for above average growth in order to catch up from that unfinished learning that we experienced over COVID, we found some similar results in our own research on growth. And so we wanted to do a little bit more. And so we dug a little bit deeper into iReady's data to look at growth measures that we have. And so as I get started and talk a little bit about what this table means, I want to first explain what stretch growth is. Stretch growth is a target that has been developed by our team at Curriculum Associates to chart a path to proficiency for students. It is a personalized and potentially multi-year target for every student that is aligned to the level of growth that is needed to reach grade level readiness. It is intended to be both an ambitious and attainable goal, and for some students, it might take multiple years to reach grade level proficiency. But as we did research last year, we did see that students were able to meet grade level proficiency over time. And so this past year, and in August, we also released this report on stretch growth. What we did was we wanted to look at students who were 2 or more grade levels below and whether or not those, or 2 or more grade levels below their chronological grade. And we wanted to look at whether or not they were able to reach grade level proficiency. And we looked at this according to whether or not they were meeting stretch growth targets, whether they were meeting just the typical growth target, and were they meeting neither of those. This graph here shows you that we have a large proportion of students who are able to meet stretch growth or grade level proficiency when they meet their stretch growth targets multiple years in a row. What we did was we looked at a 2-year time span. So this represents students who started in kindergarten. Like if we look at the first column, students who started kindergarten and the following year ended in grade 1, what percentage of those students met grade level proficiency based on what growth targets they met. So if we look at students who started grade 1 in the 2021-22 school year and ended the 2022-23 school year in grade 2. So I'm looking at the grade 2 column here on the slide. 89% of students who met stretch growth targets 2 years in a row were able to meet grade level proficiency by the end of grade 2. Those students who met just the typical growth target are the students who are represented by that light green bar, and the students who started in grade 1, ended in grade 2, 31% of those students who are meeting typical growth 2 years in a row were meeting grade level proficiency. And this slide here is reading. If you go to the next slide, you'll see similar trends in math. We see a large proportion of students who are meeting grade level proficiency if they're meeting their stretch growth targets 2 years in a row. And what this is telling us is that setting ambitious and attainable goals with students alongside what we think is individualized supports and also teaching and education practices that are proven to create better classrooms for students can support students in reaching grade level readiness. As we dug into this a little bit more, we looked at the connection, of course, with usage of iReady and usage of personalized instruction, and did see some connection there. If you go to the next slide, though, I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the schools that are meeting stretch growth targets. This is actually research that we released in July of 2022, but is still really relevant here. We did additional stretch growth research last year, and we looked at and spoke to schools that exceeded expectations in the percentage of students who are meeting stretch growth targets. And as we talked to those schools and leaders in those schools, we found a couple of key themes in terms of what is happening in those schools. I think when we look here at what the promising practices are, many of them are not surprising and will not surprise you in terms of what we think best supports students, including things like cultivating educator mindsets to support student success and creating high expectations for all students, creating a culture of data and using data to look at how students are doing and what supports and individualized supports they might need, prioritizing meeting the needs of the whole child, creating school environments that are engaging and inspiring. We also see commonalities in providing resources and supports to enhance teacher practice, and also, of course, forging a connection between school and home by engaging families. And so, we, I think that there are some things that we see schools doing that will help students, recover from the pandemic.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think it also reinforces this is not a silver bullet. It's not a one thing. It's a mix of things. I even see in the chat someone talking about in Tennessee, it has a robust tutoring program, but there's also high quality instructional materials. So thinking about this more holistically and not as a one silver bullet approach, I think is really important. Dr. Carr, what would you add to this mix? What do we know from the national picture?
Well, I first want to underscore it was a great presentation, Jennifer. Love seeing that that narrative is not a silver bullet. I think we would add, if we go to the next slide, something that we were able to discern as we went out in 2021 with a new vehicle for collecting data from schools. We call it our School Pulse Panel Survey of K-12 schools, elementary, middle, and high schools, public schools only. It's an experimental product, but it's very timely and very relevant. The administrators, those with boots on the ground, really like seeing their story told. We have modules that we rotate in and out of this data collection. Some of them we repeat And so what you have before you is the module we collected on what the schools and districts are doing. This was reported out in December of 2022. So it's not surprising to see here that schools were telling us that when they began the 2022-23 school year, students were behind. Almost 50% of the students were behind grade level in at least one subject, and not shown here, but I can tell you reading and math were the highest on that list. Also, school administrators, public school administrators told us that they were using accelerated learning strategies to promote learning recovery. So they're using grade level content, but they are mindful of the fact that students are behind. The strategies they must use, they got to keep the students moving forward, but understanding that they have got to go back and reach and get those areas, concepts, and those domain skills that they did not get before. 59% of them were telling us that. It's interesting that we collected data over several months about strategies, and high dosage tutoring was one of those modules that we collected multiple times. And when the first time we went out, we had a fairly high number of schools telling us they were doing high dosage tutoring, and we were suspect about that. So we went back in subsequent data collection and refined the definition of high dosage tutoring. And as many of your audience will know, that it is intensive 30 minutes tutoring, small group or one-on-one, with a certified or very highly trained individual, and multiple times a week, say 3 times or so a week. And when we made that refinement and definition, 37% as opposed to a much, much higher number said they were doing high dosage tutoring. 59% said they were using standard tutoring, and this could be iReady, iExcel, or intelligent tutoring, but not the high dosage, small group one-on-one type of tutoring identified in the high dosage tutoring scenario. So this is what schools are telling us. We will be back out again. I think this is the month we launched. So we'll be reporting on data on these and other types of strategies within 30 days of this current data collection.
So appreciate that, and having a picture of what folks are doing and saying they're doing is going to be so essential for us continuing to draw lessons learned. And I think your point about distinguishing between high dosage tutoring and standard tutoring also may connect to some questions that have been coming in the chat about, so what do we mean by quality? What do we mean by quality implementation of interventions? And we will come back to that in the Q&A. I want to shift us more to one more question, and then we're going to actually open up for Q&A with everyone. And the next question is, if we go to the next slide, is really about what are some things we need to think about as we start the new school year. So we've been doing this diagnosis of what all has gone on, what do we think's beginning to work, and I'd like for Karen to come back on, and because you were starting to give us some of those powerful insights with your opening framing. What do we need to think about as we start this new school year?
I think the most important thing that we need to be thinking about right now, what has to be front of mind, is thinking about dosage. We heard earlier from Avery talk about some of the strategies that we know are effective, and I completely agree with those are the right kind of strategies to be thinking about. I think what's missing from the equation is often not just, are we doing the right things, but taking it a step further to understand whether we're doing enough of the right things. So taking summer school as an instance, my colleagues here at NWEA, in partnership with about 12 districts across the country and researchers at Harvard and AIR, looked at how effective summer programming was in districts looking to use that as one of their COVID recovery strategies. And what they found was that, yes, there does seem to be some test score increases, especially in math, for students that participated in summer programming. However, and it's a really big however, the dosage falls far below what would be needed to actually make a dent in any kind of COVID learning losses. The gains that districts in this study saw equated to about 2 to 3% of the losses that they'd incurred across the 3 years in their COVID math scores. And this is because, in part, participation is pretty low, and the duration of these kinds of programs is often pretty short. So the key takeaway for this program that I think can be generalized is that even if a program is effective, it's really critical to get the dosage right. And this involves returning to the research base to understand what kind of impact could we actually expect to come from an intervention or a programming, and then make sure it's right-sized to the actual magnitude of the harm that's been incurred locally. I think of it this way: if I'm having a really intense migraine and I take half a Tylenol, I shouldn't expect to actually see any improvement. It's not that Tylenol is the wrong treatment, it's that the dose is out of alignment with the problem. Likewise, I think what really needs to be top of mind this year is getting schools to consider whether the response, the scale of their response, is actually matching the magnitude of the problem. And we've touched on this several times in this presentation already, but I think it's important to reiterate that the effort required to catch kids up, it's too great to condense in a single school year or in a single intervention. So it's really critical to be thinking about recovery not just as a multi-year effort with layered supports, and be clear-eyed that this is an effort that will undoubtedly extend past the availability of those federal recovery funds. So it's our job to help support schools and districts and how to sustain their recovery efforts in the face of those fiscal cliffs that we know they'll be facing in the very near term.
So dosage, scale, and sustainability so give kids enough time to actually benefit. What important lessons and insights that you're offering. Peggy, I'm going to ask you to come back up because you also have some insights about this, and even looking at some of the connections between absenteeism, and I think that's also kind of a dosage possibly framework to think about it. So what would you add here? And if we could have the slides come back up too.
Well, you know, it's important for students to be in school with all of this effort that we're talking about. Various effort and various dosage of the strategies. None of it will work if the child is not in school. So we have been collecting data on absenteeism in the nation's National Assessment of Educational Progress for years. What we have here is the report from the 13-year-old sample that we collected actually just in December of last year, from October of December of last year, we collected these data for this cohort. And what you see here is that the number of students for which we're finding none to 2 days absent from school has gone down from 84% to 75%. That's not what we would like to see. But conversely, the number of students who are absent 3 or 4 days or 5 or more days, and I should point out that chronic absenteeism is defined in Title I law as 10 or more days, has also gone up from 5 to 10% and from 11 to 15% for 3 or 4 days. You add those two together, you get a sizable number of students that are just not in school. So there's a concern about a new normal that is emerging that we have got to keep our eye on as we go through the new school year. There may be another.
Yes, I think there's a second slide too, just talking about some of the academic consequences of that.
Yeah, we did an interesting study using the main NAEP assessment, which is grade level, of course, not age level. And we did a fairly simple multiple regression in which we control for a number of variables over time, race, ethnicity, gender, status as an English language learner, and eligibility for free and reduced price lunch. And by controlling, I mean holding it constant over the proportion of students in the 2019 and 2022 school year, holding that constant. And what we found was quite interesting. The declines that I showed earlier in that first slide that I displayed, shown here in the blue, 5-point decline for grade 4 math, for grade 8 math, an 8-point decline, and for reading, our topic for today, 3 points declines for 4 and 8. What's interesting here is that when you control for those variables as I described, and an astonishingly consistent portion of those declines, somewhere in the range of 1 to 1.5 points, is consistently due to absenteeism, the rising rates of absenteeism. This is something that, again, is giving us cause for pause. And I should just say, not shown here, but when you compare 2019 to 2022, the proportion of students that have been identified as being absent from school doubled to about 22%. For 8th graders, something very similar. And so we need to keep our eye on this to see if we can not make this the new normal, but that is certainly what seems to be the case.
And Peggy, you've also had thoughts, and let's go to the next slide, about, so there's what's happening on the student side and absenteeism side, and then there's what's also happening with our staffing side.
Yeah.
Given the role that the relationships play in keeping kids connected to school.
Yeah, you know, before the pandemic, we were already worried as an education community about teacher vacancies. Well, after the pandemic, this seems to be exacerbated as many indicators or correlates of lower performance seems to be. You have to have teachers. You have to have qualified teachers in there to support the learning recovery goals. And what you see here, I won't go through them in detail, but you'll see that some schools of certain characteristics are experiencing more challenges here than others. 3 teaching vacancies on average is what we see nationally from these data. But you can see those in high schools are having a tougher time. Schools that can be characterized as high poverty, 75% or more minority students, schools in the cities, students and schools in the South, and those with larger schools with 1,000 or more students. So no, again, silver bullet, but we need to think about this teacher vacancy problem that has been plaguing us for a while, and now is even more important in this post-COVID recovery stage.
All right. And you had one last slide, I believe, too.
Yeah.
Next one that was talking, maybe this helps with teacher vacancies, but the issue of mental health, which I think is connected.
Yeah, you know, I guess one thing to think about is what is happening. What does it look like in the school, in the building? And what we can see here are 2 interesting indicators. Well-being of the teacher and staff seems to be a problem. Over 88% of the teachers are reporting, or administrators are reporting, that the teachers are coming to them about burnout. 82% are reporting mental health issues. You know, we've seen an increase in the proportion of students having mental health issues, but teachers too are struggling in this area. And then there's physical health issues. 51% reporting that teachers and staff are having some physical health issues. And this reminds me of other data that we collected with school crime and safety. There's been an uptick in bullying and severe disruptive behavior in the classrooms, not just from peer to peer, but also from student to teachers. On the staffing side, as the previous slide indicated, inability to fill vacant positions is something that is worrying lots of administrators. 62%, 42% are reporting that teachers are leaving. And we have a national teacher and principal survey that corroborates these findings. Many of them are leaving the profession, and then 29% are retiring. And we need them, especially those experienced ones, to hang around if in fact they have the mind to. So,
have you been able to see some ways in which people are effectively responding to this, investing in teacher well-being, investing in teacher mental health? Clearly there's a huge need. And in addition to all our other strategies of interventions with kids, curriculum, we also have to support our teaching staff. And I'm wondering if we can also while you're answering that, let's turn off the slides and let's bring the whole panel back.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly as we sort of wrap up here, we did ask schools, well, what are you doing about it? The mental health issues, the issues with teachers in particular, and they are doing everything they can. They're offering mental health days, they are offering bonuses, and because sometimes they're being overworked and having to do, their regular teaching position and then substitute for others. They're putting mental health programs in place. But I think the bottom line is that many of them reported they're concerned that they're not as effective as they would like for them to be.
All right. Jennifer, any thoughts to add into this mix about what we need to think about for next year?
Yeah, thank you, Peggy, for sharing all of that data. It is very sobering. And I think some of what we see in our data suggests that the job of teaching is becoming harder now because the classrooms look different. We have fewer students who are on grade level, more students who are below grade level, increasing numbers of students who are further behind, 2 or more grade levels behind their chronological grade. We see that in our data, and that means that teachers who may have had a class that was much closer together in terms of the needs they had was different prior to the pandemic than it is now. And so what can we do to support both teachers and students? And I think having, we talk about more individualized support. I think tutoring is a really good example of that, but making sure that students and teachers know where they are according to sort of what is needed to be on grade level, and what are the skills that they need to catch up, and being able to identify those skills very clearly. And then also, I think that parents and families need better access to the data about where their children are and how they're doing in school.
Thank you so much. And Avery, I'm going to ask you to speak to your insights about what we need to think about and sustainability, but also I might have you transition into talking about how do you think about quality as and implementation of quality programs as part of that, given the questions coming up. So Avery, what would you add to this? And then we'll shift over into some of the quality discussion.
I'll echo on what all my fellow panelists said for what school districts and teachers, et cetera, need to be thinking about next school year. The other thing that I would just highlight, right, is we know that the kind of deadline for federal funding expenditure for COVID is coming up at the end of September 2024, right? So most districts this school year are going through the process of, they've had kind of an influx of funds to spend on all these interventions and are now going through the process of saying, if they haven't already, what are we going to keep doing and keep kind of funding with our, regular budget once this kind of extraordinary funding goes away? And then what are we going to phase out, right? So I would just encourage everyone, right? We need to look at the data to see, which things were effective, which things weren't. And then even for the things that are getting middling results, if we're considering keeping it, right, really drilling down to even at the school level, if you're doing a tutoring program, like how are kids in this school performing on their math and reading tests compared to kids in this school, right? Is there any difference in the levels of experience that teachers had who are delivering the tutoring in each of those schools? Are there differences in the professional learning that you're giving the teachers in each of those districts? or each of those schools that might be influencing the variation in student scores. So we just encourage everyone to look at the data, and I think I'll drop the link in the chat, but St. Paul Public Schools has a great example of a public dashboard that both shows how they spent their federal funding, and then even at the school level, what grade bands are kind of benefiting from each intervention, et cetera. And something like that that's also publicly accessible and transparent is kind of a great starting point and exemplar for others to follow.
Great.
The other piece,
yeah, how might this connect to quality and how we look at, because quality can also explain so much about whether you get the outcomes you want. You know, unless you know your quality, you don't know whether you didn't get the outcome because what you did wasn't working, or whether kids didn't show up, or whether, you know, it wasn't implemented in the way it was intended.
Yeah, absolutely. And so maybe I can start by talking about quality specifically with regards to curriculum materials. So generally when we define something as a high quality curricular material, that means a couple things. One, it's aligned to standards, and two, it meets some benchmarks for kind of usability for both students and teachers, depending on the grade level, right? So it makes it easy for kind of students to engage with the content with kind of age, grade appropriate activities. There's also kind of guideposts for teachers to deliver that effectively. One note, right, is standards used across states and kind of organizations are often different. So this definition of high quality is going to vary slightly from state to state or by who you're talking to. But I think as an example of one thing that is universally accepted now, right, is, or maybe not universally accepted, but almost is, you know, phonics is an essential component of a high quality curricula for early grades reading, right? So that's an example of standards aligned, includes the latest evidence on kind of what we know works for teaching kids reading. And then the curricular materials will also have some guideposts for student engagement and teacher engagement and kind of meet some standards. Would encourage folks to look for resources like Ed Reports, which is a national nonprofit that kind of publishes some guidelines of what qualifies as high quality versus not. There's a couple other organizations that I saw folks mention in the chat. Would also recommend looking at that. And then secondly, I think for curricula in particular, also important to emphasize the importance of high quality professional learning and professional development for teachers to help them use that curricula. And a really tangible example for that, I think, for many of us is for upper grades math, right? So we've heard reports of parents and other teachers sometimes even saying, you know, my kid is taking X math course in 10th grade. I'm not really sure how to help him on our homework. Some of our math teachers are also struggling to have the proper fluency to deliver the content. So that professional learning that can help our teachers really understand the curricula and how to best deliver it to their students needs to be paired with the materials.
You know, that connects to a question that's in the question and answer. It's from Beth Tech asking, so how do you change educator mindsets around learning acceleration? Some don't believe that acceleration needed is practical or achievable, but as an education researcher and a parent, it's been frustrating to overcome the lack of high expectations on the part of more educators. I'm curious particularly, and either Jennifer, Karen, or Peggy, would you, what might you have to respond about this issue of teachers not really feeling like they have their mindset around what's possible? Any strategies for how you can address that?
I don't have a strategy, but we have data here at the center that supports what a lot of researchers have found. Students do better when they are in an environment where the expectations are strong and they are communicated to the students, and when they identify with the teachers. We don't have enough minority teachers, for example. Only 6% of teachers in the country are Black males, for example. So we need to think about who's teaching our children, what their expectations are. I mean, this isn't, again, we're speaking of lack of silver bullets. This isn't one. But certainly thinking about what kind of role models, what kind of cultural support can teachers provide to students that will help them to better identify with the people who are teaching them, the professionals who are teaching them.
You know, I wonder if this might also be connected to the question that Philip Steegman asked about applying principles of youth development to make sure that students are sufficiently engaged to learn it. So, for example, when I think about this around the expectations, but also the mindset, you know, one of the things from youth development is you draw upon strengths. And you make sure young people also see their strengths. So you're not always saying, well, you're not achieving this way, you're failing this way, but you see strengths and you build on that. And we actually did this is Attendance Works, did a webinar where we had Pam Cantor speaking. And she had a whole set of advice about how we have to not focus on the things that kids didn't succeed in, but we have to focus on how they can succeed and what are their experiences of success, you know, and how do you build off that? So are we finding ways to use like youth development principles to actually change in some way the quality of how we support kids and families so they feel hopeful, not hopeless in the face of the kinds of challenges that we've been facing? And I wonder, Jennifer, this is a question, like, I think about some of your Bright Spots work. Sometimes it's also finding the teacher who's getting different outcomes and then letting them talk to their other teachers and showing what they do. It's like the power of the inspirational example, and wonder if you all have been able to do that all with Curriculum Associates.
I'm thinking through, there are examples. We often bring together a lot of educators so that they can learn from each other. One example of how we highlight and elevate the work of teachers is we have an extraordinary educator program where we make sure that we bring them together, have opportunities to share experiences around what works, what they're seeing in the classroom, what they're doing in the classroom, so that they can take that back to their schools and community and share that widely. And so I think providing opportunities for teachers to engage with each other and understand what they're doing, what other schools are doing is a really great way to share best practices.
Jennifer, is there anything in actually helping teachers set stretch goals? You know, I'm thinking about, in order to set a stretch goal, you have to have that high expectations because you're gonna, create something a little bit higher. Is there any techniques, supports? What helps a teacher really set an effective stretch goal?
Yeah, so the stretch growth goal is actually set in our system based on what we know works to get students to grade level. So we have sort of a typical growth target, which is based on what we sort of expect most students to do. And then we build, and our system sort of creates that stretch growth on how, if students reach this bar over multiple points in time, do they get to grade level. So we help the teachers in establishing those stretch growth goals, but encourage them to have conversations with students and families about what those growth goals are, so that students know what they are striving for in terms of achievement. And then, going back to the earlier question around acceleration, some of what we're able to do when the assessment connects to the curriculum is also provide reports on some of the prerequisite skills that students might need to access the content in a grade level lesson. And so we provide within the system some of those supports for teachers. We know that, the teacher is critical in the classroom. So it's not only using a stretch growth goal or online curriculum, it's really about what tools and supports you can provide to teachers so that teachers can, provide instruction to students in the classroom.
So there is a question, and this may connect back to some of the points, Peggy, that you were making about, is there any data? So teachers being in the classroom, but then teachers, again, teacher attendance is part of that, and teachers being consistently present. Is there any data on teacher attendance rates and learning outcomes that help us all to also to draw this connection to how we invest in our teachers to support the learning?
Well, it's a good question. I think it is an answerable question. I don't know if I have the answer to it, but I know that we have data that could be interrogated to see if there is such a relationship. You know, it's hard because the characteristics of teachers vary quite a bit depending on whether we're talking middle school, elementary, high school. And so, you know, the cell sizes may be a little sparse, but I think it's a good question to perhaps ask of the data, even if you had to do some rolling samples over time to build up the sample size.
You know, I recall that in the early release of the chronic absence data from OCR, Peggy, and I don't know if I ever saw it later, there was a connection between levels of student absenteeism and teacher absenteeism that they were able to make. I haven't seen that. That was, you know, quite a long time ago when that first went out. But I also wonder if it's important to connect to some of the other factors. Some of the worry that I've had is that I don't want to blame teachers too. You know, sometimes the issues that are causing kids to miss are also the same issues that are causing teachers to miss. And you know, maybe there's a health concern that's going on in the school, you know, and so that's actually contributing to it. So how we interrogate that data in a way that's problem solving, not blaming, right, I think is also really critical.
Yeah. You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about 90 schools. People don't talk about them that much anymore.
What are they? I'm sorry. I'm not
sure. 90% low income, free and reduced price lunch, 90% minority, but 90% proficient. There are such schools that exist. And so, you know, you talk about interrogating the data. I think one of the most sought after policy reports that we published out of NAEP many years ago really addressed this issue and looked at these kinds of schools. Everybody just, it was like candy. I mean, these are the kinds of studies that I think we need now, more diagnostic interrogations of data that can help us identify resiliency and models for others to emulate. That's where we're going to find the answers.
You know, and this connects to a comment from Melanie Hill. It's in our Q&A talking about, we have a lot of information about the quality of interventions, quality of teachers, but what about the overall living conditions of students and families and how much that has an impact on what's happening?
We did a very interesting study. It's not out yet, but I can sort of tell you about it. It will be out soon, in which we classified schools, the environment where schools are located, into 3 different classes: those that had poor health indicators in their environment, such as death rates, poor, survival, birth rates, and things of that sort, poor conditions, lower educational levels of the adults, and so forth. And we put them into 3 classes of schools. And what we found is that the impact on COVID varied depending on how healthy the environment was where the school was located. So where we had schools that were in the most unhealthy environments, they had double-digit declines during the COVID from 19 to 22, whereas those in healthier environments, they had declines, but they were much, much smaller. So you got all of these determinants one has to think about from the place where you start and what all of your factors look like that help lift you up.
Well, and it's absolutely, and it speaks to the issue of like solutions that address the overall health conditions, the overall economic conditions that face low-income communities. I do think, you know, Jennifer, in your grid of all the things that made for the places that were better, you were actually talking about treating a whole child, or community schools, which we know that the Federal Department of Ed has been investing in. We have to actually deal with some of the structures of why certain communities and schools have a lack of access to certain resources, which fundamentally affect those outcomes. Karen, there's a question here that I wonder you might, whether you could help. It's about, is there a continued effort to support over the summer to help with the learning loss over the summer break? And I think that is also connected to what are the resources in a community, and what's happening with this, especially as we have COVID relief dollars starting to wane.
I don't have data to speak to this at the national level, but I would say from our partners that we work with on the Road to Recovery project, that summer learning opportunities are the most powerful in their minds of how to get kids connected to resources, and the most popular. And this is where they're putting a lot of their efforts to use those recovery dollars, but also these are programs that existed before COVID, and the intention is for them to exist beyond COVID. And one of my kind of Pollyanna hopes in this moment is that we're learning some new best practices for how to take the kinds of interventions and supports that have been around for some time and just learn how to do it better, how to better target the kids that would benefit from that opportunity, how to engage with parents and communities to make sure they're taking advantage of those opt-in opportunities, so that when we are beyond this moment of crisis, we can continue to apply those to help. But it's my expectation that yes, summer programs will continue for some time, if not forevermore.
And I'll just jump in and say one of the modules in the school pulse panel data collection that's out in the field now will ask schools what did they do over the summer. So we'll have some data soon about at least what they did. We don't have any information on how effective they were, but we'll know what they were doing.
Great. And Peggy, if someone wants to learn more about the 90-90-90 schools, where might they go look for more information?
Well, I got to dig that up because that's been several years now, but we'll get a reference to you.
Absolutely. And I think Ed Trust has done similar kinds of research. I'm not sure if it's exactly 90-90, but maybe Becky, we could find ways to get that information to the campaign. So when you publish the recording and the materials from this, it's included.
Absolutely, Hetty. I was just thinking the same thing.
All right. So if you all were going to, in one sentence for folks who are thinking about this coming year, and please take the engagement poll, but one sentence of advice among the panelists, we'll do this as a closing. What would you really encourage folks to think about as they're trying to tackle recovery for the next school year? And Avery, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, maybe I'll depart and have two slight points of advice. So I think one is start with the basics, right? Fundamentally, make sure that the content that you're teaching children is high quality and a high quality piece of curricula. Two, I think, and this relates to one of the questions in the chat, for teachers, school leaders, et cetera, not to become overwhelmed by the challenge ahead. It's kind of like taking 10,000 steps. The research on that's kind of debunked. If you take at least any amount of steps is better than none, right? So just take a step forward and know that there are some things that work and have proven results.
Jennifer?
I think focusing on making sure that teachers and students have the support they need, and you know, the information and data that will help them move forward. I agree with Avery. Don't be, there's a lot of challenges. And I think that sometimes looking at this data, it's very sobering. But we do see bright spots in some of our data, but bright spots in local schools and communities and classrooms. And we need to focus on some of those as well.
Peggy, and then Karen, you'll get last word.
I would say that going back to where we were before is not good enough. Trying to recover, if recovery is being defined as pre-pandemic, for some of us, that's not good news, because many students were struggling mightily prior to COVID. And I would add, in order to address that issue, one needs to focus on the whole child. There's a lot that students are struggling with: bullying, behavior that is very, very disruptive, mental health issues. It's the whole package.
Thank you. And Karen.
I would say, Peggy, that was a really good way to sum up the last word. And I think I would reiterate, my advice would just be we cannot take our foot off the gas. I get a really strong sense of fatigue in the community of continuing to talk about learning loss and continuing to show how current achievement trends compare to pre-pandemic trends. And I get the sense like, okay, this is just our new normal. Can we stop talking about it? This is just how it is now. Let's quit looking back. And I would say that would be problematic for the average kid. It would be devastating for the kids at the margins. And that, for me, is what keeps me going, that we cannot look away and just pretend that COVID never happened and that this is our new reality, because that leaves behind the kids that were already struggling mightily prior to the onset of the pandemic. And it is our charge as people in the education space to keep the conversation going so that those kids can get back on track and achieve to their potential.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Karen. And, I will just say my personal pet peeve is the issue of, oh, that level of absenteeism is the new normal. We can never accept, we can never give up on our kids. And we know it is possible to do so much better. So I appreciate all of you being in this fight together with us. And with that, I will turn it over to Becky to close us out. And thank you to all our amazing panelists.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer, Karen, Peggy, and Avery. Thanks so much for your time, for coming on and sharing with us all your expertise. Hetty, thanks so much for your extraordinary moderation. Sierra, our webinar producer in the background, thank you for keeping the wheels on the bus and things running smoothly. And to everyone who's joined us today, thanks for being here. All of the resources will be coming out to you. This conversation at the end brought to mind a couple of other webinars we've done. So I will include those in the list of resources. Those will come out a little bit later this week, along with the link to the recording and the slides and the bios for our panelists. So with that, thanks once again, and we'll look forward to having you join us for some of these upcoming webinars. We're going to continue this conversation, so please plan to join us. Thanks so much.